I awoke this morning, I think about 4 o'clock. That'd be about 8 o'clock Irish time. And I said, oh my God, like, what have I gotten myself into now? And I live in a very rural, isolated part of New Brunswick, the Miramichi, but I have a home up in the northwest Miramichi, which is where bears go to die. And I jumped in my truck this morning about 7 o'clock, and I drove up to Pat's Brook. It's about a mile down from Smoker Brook. And that's where I went as a little boy, fishing for trout in a river. And I stood by the river this morning. I said, why did they invite me here? And what am I going to say to these people? Like, who am I to be addressing people of your stature? And I just stood there by the bank of the river, and I listened to Pat's Brook flowing into the northwest Miramichi, and our voice, Kevin, just tell them your story. So tonight, I'm going to tell you my story. I was born in a very Catholic family. My dad, Bill Vickers, took me down as a child to Antigonish, Nova Scotia, to St. Francis Xavier University. Apparently, I was about a year and a half old, and there was a Monsignor Cody there, who's head of the co-op movement. And he put his hand on my head. He told my father that Kevin will be a man of great peace. The river will run red with blood, and Kevin will bring peace. As far back as I remember, my father came to my bedside each night as a young boy, and he would say prayers. And the one prayer he said to me every night was, Lord, make me an instrument of thy peace. Where there is hatred, let me sow love. Where there is injury, pardon. Where there is doubt, faith. Where there is despair, hope. Where there is darkness, light. Where there is sadness, joy. Dad, I think he cursed me. When I look back at my life, most recently October 22nd, it's been quite a ride. You know, I always think of my father and the things that he instilled in me, but it was always the values and the value of respecting the dignity of man. I learned about poverty and injustice as a very young boy, because my dad every spring would bring up about a dozen students from third world countries at the Cody Institute. And they would stay at our house, and every night around our dinner table, I would learn about the injustices of the world. I often think at the time as well, and growing up as a young boy, the importance of our faith and our Catholic service, the Catholic Mass. And we went every day to thank, and my dad always instilled in me that the most important gift that I could receive in our faith, in our belief, was the sacrament of Holy Communion. I always had a great reverence for the clergy, and there was a priest that I met early in life, and it was probably my best friend throughout his life until he left, Father Bernard Broderick, who I was especially close to. There's no question that other priests in the church had a great influence on me, especially my thinking. They had a lot to do with making me who I am. Their influence can be seen throughout the course of my life. And in fact, when I was a young boy, I thought I would become a priest. And when I went to school, when the teachers asked me what I was going to become, I would assertively tell them that I was going to become the Pope. But that was not to be. I went walking to school one day, and 3 members of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police walked out of the courthouse in red coats, and that was it. I knew exactly what I was going to become, and I became a member of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. My first posting was right here in Toronto, and out in Waterdown, just west of here at Highway 5, Highway 6. And I worked my first 3 years doing investigations against organized crime. My time here, when I became an RCMP, my heyday, I wasn't very much a Christian, and why you people would have me here even today, I think about, of all the faiths, and I want to stop right now and say the Muslim people here tonight, salam alaikum. The Jewish people here tonight, salam alaikum. And to all of you, peace be with you. But when we talk about faith and we talk about religion, we talk about Christianity, I think there's some different fault lines. And there's a lovely lady came up tonight, an Anglican clergy, who gave the grace. And when I left Toronto, I was going to be stationed in the Northwest Territories. And I went home and smart and married my high school sweetheart. But she was Anglican, I was Catholic. And of course that was going to be fine, because she's going to follow me, right? And that was all fine until her father said there's no way that he was going to go to the service if that was going to be the case. So we agreed that we get married in the Anglican Church. And we did that, and up north, Northwest Territories, and began my career in the north with the Aboriginal peoples of Canada. I was bitter about that, and I guess I'm still bitter today that my children followed Anne in the Anglican religion, and now my grandchildren are of that faith. So I guess my message here with this, like, in our faith and our Christianity or whatever tradition that we belong to, that there can be challenges to accommodate and to be inclusive with this. Up north, in the Northwest Territories, I met a priest, Father Amru, and he and I became very close friends, and I guess I learned more about values in life and about our country, and in particular the Aboriginal people of Canada. And where I was, North Yellowknife, was the Dogrit people, the Dene Nation. And I remember one day having to go up to Snare Lake, about 100 miles north of Yellowknife, dressed in my red serge, my Stetson, and my brown boots. But the first thing I had to do was go down to the Royal Bank and get a briefcase full of $5 bills, because everyone who belonged to Treaty 11 was going to receive a $5 bill once a year, and they still do this, for having ceded their territory in north of Yellowknife. And there was a deputy minister at the time from Ottawa who wanted to come up and actually see a treaty. So I went into Yellowknife, got my briefcase full of $5 bills, met up with the deputy minister coming in from a flight from Ottawa, down to a float plane, and off we went to Snare Lake, Northwest Territories. And we arrived. I set it up on a picnic table, the briefcase, and the band list. The whole community lined up. Everybody signed their name, and I gave them their $5 pursuant to Treaty 11. Afterwards, we were invited in to the community hall, and the community had all kinds of food there: moose meat, caribou meat, lake trout, whitefish. And the deputy minister was invited to speak, and the deputy minister told them how lucky they were to belong to Canada, that now they had education, they had health care, they had all these wonderful things that Canada had to offer. And I was sitting off in the corner, and in the back of the room, there's a 91-year-old lady, Monique Arrowmaker. And Monique had a cane, and I could hear her. And it took her like 5 minutes to get to the front of the room. And she reached down to her bra, and she pulled out a medallion. And when Treaty 11 was signed, there was 11 medallions that were made, and her father was given one, being the signature of the treaty. And she started, and she said, "My father signed that treaty. That was a treaty of peace and friendship. But as long as the rivers flow, the sun rises, this land is our land. Thank you very much for your $5. Thank you very much for coming here to see us today. You're always welcome. You'll always be treated well, but this land is our land." So I knew then and there that Canada has a very serious challenge in its accommodations with Aboriginal people. And again, I always will remember Father Amaru, who had taught them and gone out and learned their language and was very apostolic in teaching them about Mass and serving those people in our Christian faith, Holy Communion. My career progressed in the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. Father Raymond just talked to you about my success in getting men who were alleged to have committed homicide to admit them to me. In fact, I've taken 17 confessions from men who've killed people. And I attribute my success in that to my father and the values that he taught me, always respecting the dignity of people. And each time I would go into an interrogation room, I'd always would say to myself, regardless how repulsive the crime, I'll always respect the dignity of the person. After about my 8th time at this, Father Raymond had mentioned there earlier, members of the RCMP wanted to come and watch me to do the investigation, the interrogation of the suspect. And I remember this one particular case, the accused's name was Michael. And about 3 hours in, it wasn't going anywhere, but we got a conversation about his son, about his youth, and tears came to his eyes. And we talked more about that. And he told me about himself being sexually assaulted as a young boy. And once we got that off the table, the actual act of homicide, what I was interviewing, came about. And I walked out of the interview room, and there would be about 12, 15 other RCMP officers there. And excuse my language here tonight, but this is what they said. "You got the scumbag. You got the piece of human sewage. You got the dirt bag with all other kinds of profanities. And I just stood there and looked at myself and I said, guys, you just don't get it. As I did with all the other people that I had interviewed and successfully had them confess to the crime of homicide, I always stayed in contact with them during their pretrial detention. And I'd bring them coffee. I would go talk to them. I would bring them books to read, whatever they wanted. I'd always stay in contact with them. But anyways, Michael's trial came, and there was a very reputable lawyer out of Winnipeg that was hired. His dad had some money from Hamilton, and the lawyer that he hired was out of Winnipeg, but a guy by the name of Hirsch Walsh, who's still a very prolific name in criminal law as a defense lawyer. And Mr. Walsh went at me like, you would have said anything, you would have done anything to get my client to confess to this crime. And he attacked me. Like, I mean, it was just up one side of me and down the other in front of the judge on his voir dire in the courtroom, until his client, Michael, looked up at him and said, you leave Kevin alone. But the importance of that, again, I think is again, as I wanted to say, is respecting the dignity of people. My years passed quickly. I became an inspector in the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. I went down to New Brunswick, and in the year 2000, I looked and faced a place called Burnt Church, New Brunswick. And there was a huge crisis there with regards to the fishery of lobsters between the Acadian people and the Aboriginal people of Burnt Church. And not long after I arrived, the Department of Fisheries and Oceans went out and arrested a whole number of young Aboriginal men for fishing lobster out of season. Now, they would have fished lobster this way for centuries. It's just our society, our ways that it would have imposed these time limits with regards to the fishery. But anyways, the people of Burnt Church were expecting this, were waiting for this, and they brought in warriors, Aboriginal warriors. They brought them in from Oka, they brought them in from Gustafson Lake, Kipperwash, different places in the States, and they blocked the highway. So that very first night that they did this and set the highway, closed the highway, I was able to get our guys to set up a detour around the barricade. And I sent down 2 of our Aboriginal members, RCMP members in plain clothes, and I got them to take 2 big jugs of Tim Hortons coffee and donuts. And I said, just take it and give it to them. Well, the next day, the Premier, Bernard Lord, the communities, they wanted my head, rule of law. These guys are breaking the law. Why not enforce the law? And I was totally against that, in that I knew that there's many tools in the toolbox for a police officer, but the last tool you ever want to use is a tool of enforcement. There's facilitation, respect, education, communication, dialogue, all kinds of tools in the toolbox for police officers to use, and the tool of enforcement should be a tool of last resort. That week, at the end of that week, the Aboriginal people took the barricade down themselves because I would not allow my officers to engage in enforcement. I was the only one allowed on the community of Burnt Church. And I remember receiving a phone call one day from a desperate minister in the government, Minister Dhaliwal, asking me if I would take him into the community. And I said, I'd have to ask the community for that. And they wouldn't have anybody else to come into Burnt Church. But I remember one night there was going to be a particularly violent confrontation down, and I drove into Burnt Church, and there was a number of the warriors, and they got in the police car, and we had a dialogue, we had a conversation. And I wasn't agreeing what they wanted to do. And so I don't know why I did this, or you can't invent this stuff. I said, men, we're going to pray. And so here I was in a police car full of violent men, and I started to say the rosary, a Catholic belief with the Blessed Mother. And sure enough, they started responding. I was praying and they were answering. Now, we didn't solve anything that night, but there was no violence. And I'll never forget that it was a precipice of a crisis against the Aboriginal people of Burnt Church and white society, and that here I was, the only guy allowed onto the reserve, and I'm in the car, and I'm start praying, and the warriors prayed along with me. Burnt Church, New Brunswick, how we solved that is through education, not through enforcement. We did some research, and we found in 1758, when the Acadians were expelled from Nova Scotia, Wolfe and Montcalm were fighting it out on the plains of Abraham. Wolfe heard about the Acadians coming up into New Brunswick. He dispensed to Colonel James Murray with 3 naval ships to go down and get rid of the Acadian people. General Murray writes back to Wolfe on the plains of Abraham saying, "In allegiance to your orders, we've sailed into Miramichi Bay. We've got rid of the Frenchmen in 2 of the communities, but the 3rd community, we could not find the Frenchmen, for the Indians have taken them and hidden them from us. But we burnt everything to the ground, including a beautiful stone church, Burnt Church." And I was able to go in at the height of that crisis with the Acadian people, and again, excuse my language, get those black bastards off the water. They're destroying our life, our livelihood. And I was able to read that letter to them saying, en français, "La raison pour laquelle vous avez survécu comme un peuple," the reason that you survived as a people was only because of the Indians of Burnt Church. I went on then up to Ottawa, becoming a chief superintendent, and this was just after 9/11. And the Muslim people of Canada were feeling very, very targeted, and the whole issue across the country and the media was racial profiling. So I reached out to the Muslim community. I have a great friend in Ottawa, Mobeen Karja, and we did a series of roundtables, and we came up with a policy in the RCMP called bias-free policing, that police officers' actions would be based on interpreting the actions of people versus their color or creed. And during that time, during those periods of time, I often went to Mass, and I often remember reflecting and asking my God to help me give direction on those issues. I then became, I left the RCMP, and the reason I left the RCMP was when I became into the senior management, I saw values of being exhibited by senior managers that were not consistent with my values, especially towards women in the organization. And then I was asked if I would be interested by a company to go to the House of Commons as the Director of Security. I went down to Parliament, and walking up the hill, the first thing I saw was a father and a son playing Frisbee on the lawns of Parliament. And I said to myself, I want to protect this place. A year later, there was an open competition for the position of Sergeant at Arms. Many people don't realize what the Sergeant at Arms does, but it's a huge responsibility. Over 1,000 employees. We look after the renovations of the building and all the operations that support the running of Parliament, the buses, the mail, looking after all the members' offices, the renovation of the buildings, and of course, security. So anyways, it was a high-level interview over longitudinal block, performance management, performance measurement, performance indicators, priorities. And then they asked me, why do you want to become Sergeant at Arms? And I thought for a minute, and I told them I had an aunt, Anne-Marie, and she taught me poetry. And one of the poems that she taught me was from Robert Frost called The Mending Wall. And I started. Something there is that does not love a wall, that wants it down, that makes the frozen ground swell up under it. Before I built a wall, I would ask what I was walling in, what I was walling out, and to whom I'd be likely to give offense. Something there is that does not love a wall, that wants it down. And I looked around the table and I told them, if you make me the Sergeant at Arms, there will be no walls built around Canada's Parliament buildings. I looked around the table and they all had tears in their eyes. And I said to myself, yes, I got the job. And I was the first one interviewed that day, but I knew I had the job, you know? It's such a special place. And October 22nd was a tragic day. And I'm just hoping that we have the wisdom and the foresight of always keeping that place open. That building is not a government building. That's the House of Commons. That's your building. And don't let anybody ever stop you from going there. October 22nd. I was telling you this morning, I got up, northern New Brunswick, went up to Pat's Brook, and I always had this great relationship with Aboriginal people in Canada. But anyways, I remember they asked me why I didn't want the media here tonight, because I thought I'd probably end up going to jail if the media was here. But anyway, there's a gentleman at home, Hubert Barnaby from Eelground, one of the reserves, and it's illegal to fish with a net at nighttime. But Hubert used to take me as a young boy, and I used to go out with him. And I remember the wardens would come with their lights, and Hubert would get me with him to hide under the ferns in the forest. And the ferns would be so thick that when they shone their flashlights down on the ground to find us, they couldn't penetrate the thickness of the ferns. And I can remember reaching out, you could almost touch the fisheries officers' boots as they walked by, you know? But there was, for a second, on October 22nd, when I was on that side of that pillar with the suspect, Michael Zioff Bibo, on the other side, that I had that flashing memory of me and Hubert under the ferns, and I'll always remember that. I'm not proud of what happened on October 22nd. I'm not proud of my actions, what happened on October 22nd. People say you're a hero and all these other different things. But I'm going to tell you something that I am proud of. My mother called the following day and she said, "Kevin, Michael, I think you should come home." And I said, "Mom, I'm fine, everything's good." Though just a few hours earlier I had woken in the middle of the night crying, that night following the event. And that day, everybody knows the great standing ovation that I received in the House of Commons. And then the following day, my mother called again, and she said, Kevin, Michael, I think you should come home. I said, Mom, I'm fine. She said, yes, but your son Andrew and your daughter Laura, who are adults, they may need you here. And I said, Mom, they'll be fine. Everything's good. Friday, she calls again. Saturday, she calls. She says, Kevin, Michael, I think you should come home. So at noon hour, I called the acting clerk, Mark Bosk, and I said, Mark, I got to go home. And I'm driving home, it's 1,000 kilometers, so I'm in northern New Brunswick about 4 o'clock in the morning, driving across the Plaster Rock Renews Highway. And I think of the 17 men that I've taken confessions of that have killed people. And I'm thinking of the man that I had shot 3 days before at the House of Commons. And I said, what am I going to do? And I said, when I get home, I'm going to pray for him. So I arrived home, 4:30 in the morning. I phoned our family priest, Father Leon Creamer. I said, Father, would it be possible you come up at 11 o'clock this morning and say Mass? He said, Kevin, I'll be there. I phoned my daughter Laura, who lives down in Moncton, New Brunswick, and she was awake, breastfeeding my 4-week-old grandson. And she said, Dad, I'll be there. My dad has a couple of sisters who are Catholic nuns down in St. John, New Brunswick, 88 and 83, Margaret and Charlotte. I woke them up in the middle of the night. I said, Father Creamer's coming up to say Mass tomorrow morning at 11 o'clock. They said, we'll come. They had about a 3.5-hour drive. I went to bed, 8:30 in the morning, I got up, I called my mother. I said, Mom, I'm home. She was ecstatic. I phoned my son Andrew, who's a police officer, and my sister Mary. 11 o'clock that morning, we all met at my log home on the northwest Miramichi, not far from Pat's Brook. In the Catholic faith, in the Catholic service, we do readings from the Bible, and after the readings, we have prayers, intention of faith. And my mom always reminding me of my dad's values, respecting the dignity of people, said a prayer for Kathy Cirillo, Nathan Cirillo's mom. Nathan was shot and killed that day. And then she said a prayer for the man who I shot, Suzanne Ziaf-Bibo, and she said a prayer for her. And sitting there with my 4-week-old grandson, my 3-week-old grandson, and my granddaughter Reese, 6, I reflected on my faith, on the Bible, and I thought the first person that Jesus allowed into the kingdom of heaven was a convicted criminal who was crucified alongside of him. It's probably one of the proudest moments of my life that I said a prayer and asked for forgiveness of the man that I shot with my 3 grandchildren in my lap, standing next to me. And, you know, society's become full of hatred, full of, how could you do that? I mean, this man shot and killed Nathan Cirillo, cowardly act of violence. Why would you pray for him? And I've had a great deal of reflection about that, God and Christianity and religion, traditions and faith and religion. And, I realize tonight what you people from Cardis and you're trying to do with faith 2017 and getting public figures to talk and learn what they did. But if there's a message that I could give you, an example that I could give you, that I think encompasses what you really want to get out and do, is last April I was invited to go to Los Angeles to receive the Medal of Valor from the Simon Wiesenthal Center. So I went there, and there was a co-recipient of a Medal of Valor that was posthumously given to a young lady by the name of Renal Trudeau of Israel. And she was the wife of a Sergeant Zidan Zief, a policeman from the Israel Druze community. And he was shot and killed by 2 terrorists on the 18th of November last year. But he and this young lady, Renal Trudeau, they'd just been married and just had a son days of the incident. And as I say, he was killed by 2 terrorists. And when she came to get the medal, her young son was only 4 months old. But during the acceptance speech, I'll never forget this. Renal said to the audience, "I do not hate these men. I do not seek revenge. I ask only for their forgiveness. For I want our son to know the power of forgiveness and the weakness of hate. These men were instruments of evil. My husband was an instrument of peace." So I leave that with you. And I can't close and can't finish without saying the power of faith, the goal of faith 2015. But we have a great country. But our country can do better. I'm going to give a speech next week in St. John, New Brunswick, to raise funds for the Salvation Army. And what I've learned preparing for that speech is that 1 in 10 Canadians live in poverty. That's 10% of our population in Canada lives in poverty. So regardless of your tradition, regardless of your faith, I ask all of you to reflect upon that. And as we move forward as Christians, Jews, Muslims, and all the other faiths, I even met some Calvinists here this evening, that we dig down, and that's just not acceptable. Canada can do better. We can do better with our faith, with our traditional beliefs. And I take that all of you. My speech tonight comes from my heart. I still don't understand, Father Raymond, why you'd invite a poor boy from the North Shore of New Brunswick to an audience like this. But from the bottom of my heart, thank you very much.